So it's this violent logic of dispossession at the level of the subject which interests me, but it also, what interests me is this logic of dispossession at the level of spatiality, or spatiality and subjectivity in a sense, because what we've now moved to in terms of warfare is a manhunt. Okay, it's no longer like one population against another population. The war happens where the subject who is targeted. I don't know if you know this, but every Tuesday Barack Obama meets with his advisors to decide on a kill list. Do you know this? And
I didn't know how often it was. Yeah.
If you're on his kill list, basically you're a subject to be hunted down. Okay, so and the territory of war shifts there as well, because wherever the subject is, the drone will go. Okay, so it's not within specific borders or specific territories or specific states. It can move. So there's a mobility to drone warfare. Now, the logic of necropolitics also challenges those who are displaced and displaceable to take their proper place. Okay, so their proper place is, of course, that they have no place, that they're non-being, but it's arbitrary, the assignation of posability or disposability. And again, I would play on posability and disposability, because we remember the famous images, which were cell phone images of Abu Ghraib. Largely those who are deemed to not be disposable are children. So when a drone operator sees children, I don't know if you've seen, there's a new movie out with Ethan Hawke in it called Good Kill. I think it's quite recently out. I haven't seen it yet. But in the trailer, there's one scene in the movie that you can see in the trailer where the children come into the frame of the drone operator's sight too late, and the target has already been launched. But very often, if you read Gregoire Chamayou's book Drone Theory, he has dialogue between drone operators and their supervisors, and they're trying to ascertain from the optical field if there's a child in the frame. If there is a child, they don't shoot. But in general, adult lives, whether they're soldiers or civilians, are lives which are uncountable or don't count. Now, there was the magic figure of 30, which is that if you kill 30 civilians, that's okay, but if you kill 31, the president, Obama, has to be notified. So the magic figure of civilians' lives that are worth counting is 31 upwards. But the figures for the numbers of dead from drone strikes in various different countries, the civilian casualties are largely unaccounted for. So it's, again, I'm quite interested in this idea of computation and the calculable and mattering, because what Butler says is that legally numbers can be very controversial when you try and ascertain what the arithmetical calculus how many members of the population have died. Okay, so if they're on your side, they count. If they're on the other side, or the enemy side, in inverted commas, they don't count. So there's no victims from the victor's side, or from the drone operator's side. There's no victims of stray drone fire. So Butler asks, like, under what conditions would numbers come to count, or in what conditions would the numbers come to be uncountable? And she says that we cannot calculate the value of life, but that we have to find a way of interpreting numbers that allow us to see who lives and who dies under certain political regimes. So it's important to think about, very carefully about the ways in which life and death get conceptualized within drone warfare or contemporary modes. There's a theorist called Saad, he calls contemporary warfare death dealing, which dealing is an interesting term again in terms of the idea of it's almost like a card game. And Amanda will know that there are a lot of people recruited to be drone operators are video game players, or the very best video game players.
Yeah.
And yet their joystick here is determining whether someone is to be killed or not. What lies in their hands is lives which are to be lost, and whether that can be justified or not, according to political, religious, cultural traditions, and what losses are legitimated by nations and states. Obviously, its own soldiers, for example, would be counted as lives which are lost. So you do have occasionally stray drone fire which kills American soldiers on the ground themselves, or Israeli soldiers on the ground. There's also the question of drones and sacrifice, the giving up of one's life. So I'll talk a bit about that in terms of suicide bombing now in a second. So just as sort of the levels of social meaning are striated or graduated, also access to power or just techniques of power are uneven in their distribution. Resources and vulnerability are unequally distributed among different bodies, and that obviously would leave racialized or differently gendered or differently racialized bodies at the very bottom of the heap when it comes to social meaning. Under neoliberal governance. And queer theory hasn't had very much to say about these kinds of issues. Certainly drone warfare, for example, even though it's interesting in terms of masculinity, and the idea that the masculinity of the drone operator, even though there are lots of female drone operators, is somehow placed in terms of its worth against the masculinity of the soldier who is in the field fighting in face-to-face combat. But if we look back to 2005, when Jose Munoz and Jack Halberstam and David Eng were asking about what the most pressing global emergencies were for thinking about what queer theory could do, or queer theory ought to be talking about, they say that we should be thinking about the triumph of neoliberalism and the collapse of the welfare state. That's clearly still very much on our agenda. They also mentioned the Bush administration's infinite war on terrorism, which we can now call the Obama administration's infinite war on terrorism. The acute militarization of state violence, which is still with us. The escalation of US empire building and the clash of religious fundamentalisms, nationalisms and patriotisms. That's even more so with the Patriot Act and so on. The devolution of civil society and the erosion of civil rights. The pathologization of immigrant communities as terrorist and racialized populations as criminal. Still a key issue. The shifting forms of citizenship and migration in imputedly post-identity and post-racial age. The politics of intimacy and the liberal recoding of freedom as secularization, domesticity and marriage, and the return to moral values and family values as a prophylactic against political debate, economic redistribution and cultural dissent. So of that list of pressing issues that we should be attending two in order to bring about a different order of things. It's probably only domesticity and marriage which have been of interest, at least at the level of queer activism or queer politics. And if we jump to 2012, to that book which Butler wrote with Atanasu on dispossession, they named the pressing emergencies as the war on terror, the economic disparities between nations and subjects, economic exhaustion, the normalization of poverty and precarity in the context of capitalist crisis management, racism, the policing of migration, and the ongoing regimes of colonial occupation. So you can see that those lists overlap in all sorts of ways. Okay. So the argument I would make is that contemporary queer theory needs or requires modalities of thought or analysis or creativity which would attend to or elaborate on these particular formations. And one such formation, which Jasbir Pawar, for example, has talked about, is the figure of the suicide bomber. When I talk about the suicide bomber in her reading as a queer subject or an anti-identity, so in the figure of the suicide bomber, you've got an intertwinement of racialized and gendered perversion, or also perverse sexuality. So what Jasbir Pawar tries to do is think about the suicide bomber more in terms of its movement, its spatiality, its temporality, its corporeal convergences or implosions and rearrangements. So to think of queerness in the same way that I said Butler does, less as an entity or an identity, and more in terms of it as an assemblage. However, where I would part company with Pawar is that she says that thinking about the suicide bomber as an anti-identity does away with excavation work. I would think the excavation work or the forensic work is still just as important, even at the same time as we do away with binary oppositions between queer and non-queer subjects. And also when we think of the suicide bomber, if we think about it in terms of its disruption and dissension and its resistance or its alternative queerness, we have to suspend a certain moral calculus. So sexuality, we would agree, I think, is crucial to the production of the geopolitics of American exceptionalism. But despite that, there has been quite a dearth of queer critical attention to or under-theorization of the sexualized figure of the terrorist within queer theoretical emphasis or debates on the war on terror, even though Saddam Hussein was very often figured as sodomized or Saddamized in a play on his name. And you also had slogans on bombs during the Gulf War, which were homophobic slogans. And of course, one reading of the Twin Towers in 9/11 is that it was an attack on the phallic masculinity or the phallic structuration of American nationhood or American geopolitical aspiration, and that this is what causes such an attempt to shore up that masculinity with a war against them or figures who are thought of as enemy. So I think it's important to think about terrorist corporealities and the way that they are salient for queer thinking. So to think about them in terms of a monstrosity, which is in the sense of monstrare, to show or to demonstrate, as something which is monstrous, but not in the pejorative sense. More in the sense of what they can tell us about corporealities and spatialities and temporalities. But also I think that in some ways the nature of the suicide bomber is to pass under our threshold of discernibility. You know, what does a suicide bomber look like? You have this. There will be software, no doubt, which will eventually tell us what a suicide bomber looks like. I know there's work on the voice recognition software, which is apparently can tell you if someone is a suicide bomber, which makes very little sense to me. But I think that's why forensic aesthetics is a useful tool for thinking about these things. Now, in terms of drones, you see this shift in the way that armed violence has moved to seeking prey wherever it is. So it's no longer in the place of hostilities as such, but or defined in terms of a locatable space, a zone or a territory. The notion of armed conflict is no longer bordered, and the idea of a particular space of conflict no longer holds, because the combat zone in drone warfare is reduced very specifically to the body of the enemy. And the most spectacular example, of course, would be Osama bin Laden. So wherever bin Laden was the space of war, or the space to be targeted. And Shamayou was this a mobile microspace, and it can be, the subject can be targeted wherever it happens to be. Okay, so there's a sort of limited or unlimited virtual extension of the field of war. So the conflict zone, in a sense, becomes the entire globe. So the globe becomes the battlefield on which. So that's very interesting in terms of video games as well, I think. Also, the question of sovereignty gets opened up there, because insofar as the zones in which these kinds of conflicts take place are no longer actually zones of territorial conflict. So if there's no armed conflict going on in the space in which a drone attack happens, then how does one respond to that in terms of legality of the law? International law doesn't recognise the right to kill with battlefield weapons outside of a zone of conflict. So every drone strike legally is extra legal, or it's extrajudicial, in the sense that it does not recognise international law. So the so-called global war on terror actually is a global war on terror, but it is a rogue war, or an extra-legal or extrajudicial war, because if you have these targeted assassinations or lethal manhunts in what Obama calls the kill box, they're just as illegal as the extraordinary rendition of subjects, or the indefinite detention of subjects in Guantanamo Bay or various other places, Abu Ghraib, for example, around the globe. So a drone strike is always, I would say, illegitimate in terms of its zone of conflict. And it's ironic that Obama and the US claim that justice has been done after each drone strike, because, the Israelis surely make similar claims too, because that would run aground in terms of killing an unarmed target, because it's incompatible with international criminal justice. So there's been a lot of argument about whether drones as weapons are ethical in themselves, because they prevent loss of lives. Yeah, they prevent loss of lives on the side of air crew, but they cause massive loss of life in terms of civilian deaths and also the deaths of soldiers. So there's nothing that morally justifies an unmanned airstrike, although the argument very often is in terms of self-defense. So you are killing a purported enemy before they have the chance to kill you, which is precisely the logic of killing the homeless man in LA, or wasn't there another case last week?
Yeah, South Carolina.
Where a policeman actually did get charged. Yeah. Which is quite interesting, but it was the same idea that an unarmed subject can be killed with impunity, or in this case, it was punished or punishable. But very often, this sort of death machine aspect of the necropolitical means that the political terrain is one in which certain subjects are killed simply because they are purported to be an enemy or someone who is going to attack first. So there's something in that, though, which is about their unknowability and their monstrousness in that sense, that their difficulty in being seen or difficulty in being heard. That seems to me to be useful in terms of thinking about sensible politics or sensate politics. The ways in which we use sounds or images as claims to justice or claims to livability, which clearly worked in the case of, is it North Carolina or South Carolina?
South.
Yeah, well, it would be. Yeah, so South Carolina, where video evidence actually led to a democratic or just decision. So sound and image actually can be useful in terms of bringing about democratic effects. And the funny thing about sound is that, well, it's not funny, but the thing about drones is the sound is unbearable. So there's all sorts of argument recently from forensic experts that the noise sound causes such trauma and brings about this sort of constant fear of being put to death or fear of being attacked. So you have also people presenting in these regions with the psychical traces of just drone, the audibility of drones, which is interesting, but they can't detect smell. Right? That's fascinating. Which also has led me to think about sniffer dogs, or the way dogs are used in warfare. So in manhunts, very often dogs were used, but now you have policemen using dogs, and the dogs are trained to smell out certain subjects who are deemed to be the other or the enemy, and so on. And the overwhelming evidence is that it's racialized subjects who are subjected to the violence or injuries caused by the police dogs.
Excuse me, Michael, could you please explain? I'm sorry, did you say drones can smell? I missed that.
No, they can't.
Oh, they cannot. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to some kind of heat sensing quality. I thought I missed something. Thank you. Okay, I understand now. Okay, got it.
I think, yeah. I mean, the senses of drones are interesting because they can see. Although, from what I've read, their optical abilities are not as amazing as one would think. So there are often mistakes in terms of not just inability to see a subject, but also inability to see whether the building targeted is the target. So that it's not even their